Very well. Welcome back. Let us get back to work. It is with great pleasure. It's also an honor for us to welcome here Professor Betancourt, Raoul Fornet Betancourt, who was actually quoted time and again over the last few days. Professor Emeritus of Intercultural Philosophy, Director of the Interdisciplinary Intercultural Cooperation Institute of the University of Aachen in Germany. He was born in Cuba. He received his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Aachen and the University of Salamanca. He obtained his habilitation doctorate at the University of Bremen. He's also an honorary professor at the University of Aachen and at the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos in Lima, Peru. Currently, he is director of the International Research Institute for Intercultural and Interdisciplinary Collaboration in Eichstätt and the International School of Intercultural Philosophy. He has received many awards and accolades over the last few years, but he was the initiator and coordinator of the South-North philosophical dialogue of the Société Européenne de Culture. His works have been translated in several languages, in Russian, Polish, Italian, Portuguese, French, and English. There are more than 150 academic papers and articles about his work. So Professor Betancourt today will provide us his contribution on university education and the challenge of interculturality as a way of life and thinking. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for your presentation. First of all, I want to thank heartily Professor Luca Pandolfi for this invitation. I'm very sorry. I will continue in Spanish because my Italian is very poor. So sorry about that. I will speak in Spanish. So first, an introductory observation. This International Congress has its focus of reflection and discussion on the issue of the challenge that intercultural formation represents today, and specifically within the framework of the pontifical universities and ecclesiastical faculties. So, I'd like to begin by indicating that I understand the title of my paper in the sense that interculturality, insofar as it calls for a new way of living and thinking, enlivened by the resonance in it of the polyphony of the world, constitutes a challenge for the current university institution in general, both in terms of the ordering and classification of knowledge, and in terms of the training that it transmits. This understanding of the title of my paper means at the same time that I start from a perception of the current university, in which the latter appears as an institution that does not respond to the demands of cognitive, hermeneutic, and methodological justice, nor to the demands of anthropological transformation that in the vision of intercultural philosophy, at least according to my interpretation, these changes will be necessary for the realization of a humanity that goes through the way of interculturality. because this is important because tolerant coexistence is important in every society, but loving coexistence must be based on principles that are not functional. And this is the great demand at the basis of interculturality. And if you ask me what is the explanatory reason, what explanatory reason can be given for this negative perception of today's university as a place resistant to interculturality, indeed as a place that contradicts the hope of a humanity in intercultural coexistence, in short, and to put it very clearly, the reason that for me explains this negative perception is that university today has made a pact with a hegemonic capitalist civilization that today decides the course of development of the peoples of the world, and with it also the meaning of the education that is needed in the so-called global society of this world. In the context of this explanation, I'd like to recall that in the proem of the Apostolic Constitution Veritatis Gaudium, Pope Francis wrote the following, and I quote, "In all countries, universities are the primary seat of scientific research for the advancement of knowledge and society, playing a decisive role in economic, social, and cultural development, especially in a time like ours, marked by rapid, costly, and visible changes in the field of science and technology." Pope Francis is absolutely right with that statement. But even if he's right, it is worth asking, why university play this determining role today in contemporary world. And I think that the reason for which universities are so important today comes from the fact that they have been captured by the system of our capitalist civilization, because one of its most decisive pillars in modern science and technology that arrogate to themselves the monopoly of true access to the real and to life. So, despite the undoubted spaces of freedom that there are universities, many professors and researchers have these spaces of freedom for their work. But in spite of these spaces do not weigh enough to free the institution from the networks of the system. That is why I think that it should be recognized that the difficulties that universities have with interculturality come from the fact that as institutions of teaching and research, they are generally at the service not of humankind in general, but of the world that constructs the hegemonic civilization that rules over us. In other words, what hinders today the relationship between university and interculturality, which should be an internal and connatural relationship, by the very idea and mission of the university as a community conjured up for the search of the truth, for the search for truth, is its sitting and belonging to a mechanistic civilization that instrumentalizes it, that exploits it, precisely to optimize the dynamics of its progress and consolidate its hegemony at the planetary level. In a world where there is this hegemony, and more specifically in a world where the interest to intensify predominates, this interest to reinforce this hegemonic strategy predominates. In this world, there is no space for interculturality. So these are enemies that should be kept out. Interculturality is an enemy that should be kept out because it destabilizes the hegemony of power. For the present paper, it follows from the above that a critique of the established university system and the education it provides must begin by being a critique of that world that has domesticated the spirit of the university and has exploited it, has instrumentalized it to such an extent that it has robbed it of the original ethos to which we alluded earlier. So, my first point then will be a brief critical reflection on the global world that today's hegemonic civilization is constructing, and which is at the heart of the current misunderstanding between the university institution and the vision of an alternative intercultural world. A second point will follow, in which I will try to outline some considerations to meditate on the question that for me is decisive, because its answer depends on the university and the interculturality meeting again and recognizing each other as moments of a common spiritual movement for the good of humanity. And the question is this: how can this pact, sometimes tacit, sometimes clear, explicit, between the university and the world of hegemonic civilization be cancelled? Let's go back to the first point, the words of today's hegemonic civilization as a project adverse to an intercultural humanity. You very likely notice that I have referred to the contemporary world that hinders the relationship between university and interculturality with the expression of the word of hegemonic civilization. Of this word I speak at this point. That is, I speak of the word in the restricted sense imposed by the civilization that configures it today. And I begin this point with this clarification, because this clarification helps us to understand what follows. Today's world is adverse and challenges interculturality, not because it is the contemporary world, but on the contrary, because it is not much of a world. We don't have so much of a world. Certainly we have at our disposal many objects, devices, and techniques of all kinds. Even we have a world with many new idols, as Pope Francis said. And everything is part of this world. But what do I mean by that? That despite of this, we have not so much of a world. I'm referring to a world that has been reduced to a model of a certain kind of civilization. So just as Ludwig Wittgenstein was able to say that die Grenzen der Sprache, die Grenzen meiner Welt bedeuten. That is, the borders of language are the borders of my world. And Martin Heidegger affirmed that die Sprache ist das Haus des Seins in ihrer Behausung wohnt der Mensch. Language is the house of being. In its dwelling man dwells. So could the man of today say that the borders of our civilizations turned into the borders of our world, and that the house of this world was turned into our only dwelling place. So we are far from the other conception of the world, very far from the other conception of the world, in the light of which Pope Francis says in Laudato Si that the world, even today, is not only a problem to be solved, but also a mystery. But in the world of in our world, there is nothing that is a mystery. So I speak then of a world that, if I may say so, that has been put into the case of our civilization, the small case of our civilization. And there are many names by which sociologists, above all, have tried to designate a common denominator of the complex contents of this case, such as scientific technical world, for example, world of the consumer society, world of the risk society, world of the virtuality, liquid world, the secularized world, etc. These are all names that help us to direct, to orient ourselves in our modern societies. But they are also names that betray a huge desire for homogenization, and by the same token, an attempt to reduce or cover up the diversity of human life, a paradoxical situation, a name that hides the paradoxical situation in which we find ourselves. And what is this paradoxical situation? Namely, the historical situation that the more we progress in the construction of this world to the measure of the hegemonic, mechanicistic, and capitalist civilization, the more we regress in the experience of the world as a living organism with a metabolism marked by the open coexistence of differences. So, in our so-called contemporary world, we are witnessing a paradox, a spectacular process of substitution of the world. So we are being robbed of the world in a way. The world as an organism or as a creation is replaced by a case. And it is necessary to pay close attention to this, because in this process of substitution, a change takes place that sharpens the adverse character of this construction in the face of interculturality. So with this substitution, the fundamental references of cardinal points for orientation in the human search for meaning are changed, as somebody said this morning, because the substitution of the word entails a rupture of the ties, a radical rupture of the ties with the transcendence, with nature, and even with the human community. The substitution of the world also implies a process of detranscending the real, of denaturalization of the human being, and decommunitarization of existence. But with this rupture of the bonds of attachment that allow man to feel as being with roots in heaven and earth, the substitution of the words of the word of which I speak here confronts us with one of those fearful questions that I could call, using the title of a book by Kierkegaard, these are questions whose treatment provokes fear and trembling. And one of these issues that cause fear and trembling is the following. In this world of today, are we not also witnessing, suffering it on our own skin, witnessing a substitution of the memory of the human in the being of today's man? Can we really change the world without changing the memory, the human memory? This question, as it seems to me opportune to observe it in an intellectual context where the incidence of post-humanist ideology is discussed, does not put on the table the problem of the challenges that would be posed by a cultural situation in supposed transit towards a transhumanist perception of man, but rather seeks to find out if, in this world of today, a human type is emerging that, projected as a necessary correlate or simple correlate to ensure the stability and optimize the fair functioning of this world. So whether the human being is content to be something like the showcase of the contents of the case in which the hegemonic civilization enclosed the world. So this would be the end of inner life in the way we know it, the showcase man. And I confess that I would not dare, or not have the courage to give an affirmative answer to that question. Indeed, I think it would be neither prudent nor fair to affirm it, since we all know that there is more to the world than the one presented to us by capitalist propaganda. But on the other hand, all of this is a source of concern, and I also think that there are abundant symptoms of individual and social behavior in the man of today that allow us to speak of an anthropological mutation in progress, precisely as a consequence of the impact that the current civilization exerts on the way in which man understands and practices the relationship with himself, or if one prefers, the inner life. This is my first point. Then the second point, how to cancel the pact between the university and the world of hegemonic civilization. From the above considerations, it can be deduced that the relevance of the question we pose in this second point comes from the idea that without cancelling the pact with the epistemic, social, pedagogical, etc., established by the hegemonic civilization. In a word, if university do not dare to get out of this capitalist hegemony, then the university will not be able to become a place of formation for a loving intercultural coexistence in a world liberated for diversity, for transcendence, and for the community. So without these, we would not have the density of a world that is necessary for interculturality. But how can we become aware of the need for this rupture? So I'm not here to offer recipes, but I would say, especially in this context of a pontifical Catholic or anyway Christian inspired universities where this Congress places us, we can begin by taking an honest look using the authority of a martyr, Father Ignacio Echacuria, who was murdered. He was director of a Central American university in El Salvador. He said that must become aware of the bourgeois structure to which the administration, the curricula of universities in the contemporary world respond. So we have to oppose this need, we must be aware that this bourgeois structure to which the university depends, and we must consider the demands that derive from this belonging for the orientation of formation, while we should serve the kingdom of God and its justice. Secondly, through the discernment of the mission of the university that the above-mentioned contrast entails and the conflict of demands that it uncovers as a call to take a stand awareness, could grow for a change of seat. Or as theologians would say, a change in the Sitz im Leben of the university. In other words, to change the place, to cultivate the conscience in order to get out of the system and enter into dialogue with life. And then here there is also an important moment that we find in Veritatis Gaudium by Pope Francis. He opted for the dialogue between cultures. So an encounter between all authentic and vital cultures, he writes in Veritatis Gaudium. And in the light of this, I would say that this dialogue would indicate the way to begin in a concrete way, the change of place of the university, its exodus from the hegemonic horizon on the basis of a new cartography that makes visible the multiple places of meaning of the human that have been buried, marginalized, or disavowed as anachronisms and denied by the mechanisms of the planetary civilization. As a consequence, the university would walk with cultures and their wisdoms, seeing them, these forms of wisdom, not as simple and mute objects of research for professionals of knowledge and students hungry for data, but as companions in the pilgrimage through the diversity of the world. And with this new cartography, I would say, as a fourth point, our university can renew itself from a pluritopical perspective, and at the same time project itself as a place that calls for the united congregation of the knowledge of humanity, as the utopia that calls for a solidarity-based union of all the knowledge of humanity. Why? Because if there is one thing that can be learned in this mutual letting oneself be accompanied by all authentic and vital cultures in this pilgrimage through the world, as Pope Francis says, we can learn that humanity, even if it is late and with the bad smell and everything, so it is humanity that with its own accent would formulate the ancient question of job. But wisdom, where does one get it? Where is the deposit of prudence? And isn't this the question, this jobs question, that an intercultural formation should help to ask more and more intensely? And isn't it the question that should ultimately move us? So where is wisdom? So isn't this question that should move us to exodus, to get out of this system? Okay, I thank you for your attention.
Grazie a lei.
Thank you, Professor Betancourt, especially for the profound approach that you have offered to us. You started with a very clear statement, and you said universities have lost their freedom. Universities have become corrupted and let themselves be corrupted. So it is high time that universities recover their original ethos, their original freedom, which means serving the gospel of Jesus Christ and looking together for truth by putting together the knowledge of humankind. That's quite interesting. I cannot add anything more because I believe that indeed we will have to ponder your presentation for a while to really metabolize all its richness. And I would like to introduce to you Professor Judith Gruber. She's Professor of Systematic Theology at the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium and Director of the Center for Liberation Theologies of the same university. She received her PhD in Catholic Systematic Theology from the University of Salzburg in Austria, and subsequently she was Assistant Professor of Systematic Theology at Loyola University in New Orleans. In 2017, she joined the Catholic University of Louvain. Her research focuses on the intersection between systematic theology and critical cultural studies, with particular specialization in intercultural theology and post-colonial theology. Professor Gruber will entertain us in the next half hour, and the title of her presentation is Letting All Voices Speak? Decolonizing World Christianity, Insights from Intercultural Theology. Professor is online. I believe that she can hear us, so I would like to give her the floor at this point. Thank you.
Well, hello from Belgium. Good afternoon, good morning to all the world around here. I'm very happy to be able to join you online. It would be even better, of course, to be in Rome, but under the current circumstances, perhaps this is what it is. So I'm very, very happy about this invitation. I'm very grateful for the invitation, and I would like to thank Professor Pandolfi and his excellent team for organizing this conference. I have learned a lot over the past few days. In my contribution, I would like to turn to intercultural theology, to see what kind of ideas, what kind of concepts can that field contribute to the discussions we have had about multiculturalism and of how we should move from multiculturalism into interculturalism, and what that actually implies for theology more explicitly. I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation, so give me just a second to share my screen. Does that work for everybody? I think I see a little nod here, which is great. Thanks very much. Yeah. So the title of my presentation is Letting All Voices Speak, and I have added a question mark here. And I will explain that question mark in the next 20-25 minutes or so. And I will start out by kind of just giving a very short introduction into intercultural theology, into the origins of intercultural theology, so that we know that it has a specific historical origin, as an origin that shapes the conversations in this field. That shapes the conversations in this field. Intercultural theology emerged in the wake of the decolonization movements of the mid-20th century, and it rests on the insight that theology has been complicit with empire, and intercultural theology, therefore, and this is kind of the founding myth of that theological discipline, of that theological field, it therefore tries to find ways of doing theology that do not buttress but that challenge hegemonic regimes and colonial empires. So intercultural theology is very much on the search for a theology after empire. And in doing so, it finds orientation in a crucial insight of post-colonial studies. And this crucial insight is that empires establish political sovereignty through epistemic violence. And empires do that either by co-opting or by excluding other people. So the idea here is that empires are power knowledge regimes that rest on the erasure of subaltern voices. And I think we've heard, particularly in the first day, a lot more to that theoretical background that I'm building on here, or that I'm rooting the field of intercultural theology here. The idea here is that empires function as totalitarian regimes, either by co-opting or by excluding other voices. They establish not only political, but also epistemic sovereignty. Now, and intercultural theology, understanding itself as a decolonial project, now tries to resist that totalitarian logic of empire. And very often, this is pursued through the ideal of letting all voices speak. The goal is to include voices that have hitherto been silenced, to include them in the conversations, to bring them onto the round table, so to speak. And here comes the question mark. In my contribution, I will critically interrogate this enterprise of recognition and inclusion. And I will show that it is not necessarily decolonizing, but can in fact actually have recolonizing effects. It can reinscribe a colonial logic of expansion. My guiding question here is, how can erased voices be recuperated in ways that trouble rather than reinscribe that totalitarian logic of empire? So my argument is decolonization is not necessarily decolonization, as that attempt, but it can actually end up reinscribing the logic of empire. So to be very carefully looking into those dynamics. My central argument will be that current methodological considerations in intercultural theology begin to develop strategies for undoing that imperial bias that has inscribed itself historically into the Christian tradition. And we have seen these, or we've talked about these methodologies over the last few days in the contributions to this Congress. The dominant theological imaginaries which orient the field, however, will be my argument, continue to be informed by the totalitarian logic of empire. So I'll be looking into the theologies that inform intercultural theology and look if there is maybe perhaps a silent colonial logic still at work with them. And I aim to substantiate this claim with a closer look at one of the theological imaginaries that have been very influential in intercultural theology and this project of letting all voices speak. And this theological metaphor, this theological theologumenon is kenosis. Kenosis, ancient Greek for self-emptying, is a term in Christian theology that describes how Christ, in becoming human, has relinquished all divine attributes, such as omnipotence, omniscience, and impassibility.
Professoressa?
Yeah?
Sì, we didn't see the slides.
You don't see the slides. Let me just give you 1 second, but you can hear me.
Devono andare avanti.
They do not move forward. The slides are not moving forward. We're only...
No?
No, it's not working. No.
We seen just the first. The
Okay,
first
so it
slide.
doesn't move forward. Let me see. Maybe this is working better. No?
Just the one. Can you go? Yeah.
I'll try one more time. Otherwise, we'll just skip the slides. I have several options here. Now?
I see the first slide.
Yeah.
Letting all voices speak.
It doesn't work. I will just stop sharing and just talk to you and try and hope that you can follow me nonetheless, right? So at least it's a better way of engaging, especially because I can't be there in person anyway. So the point of what I am investigating right now is theological imaginaries actually have a silent colonial logic inscribed into them. And the example I'm using is kenosis. Kenosis, the ancient Greek for self-emptying, that shows how, or that theologizes that Christ relinquishes divine attributes such as omnipotence and impassibility. And indeed, intercultural theologies use kenosis to talk about the disavowal of power and an embrace of vulnerability as a way of theologizing empire, after empire. So the goal here is, when intercultural theologians talk about we have to do kenotic theology, is to let go of the presumption that there's an unchangeable certainty in the construction of theological meaning. And in this way, kenosis has become a shorthand to advocate for epistemic humility in the theological knowledge production in order to undo the erasure of other voices. So by engaging in kenotic ways of producing knowledge, we make space for voices that have hitherto been excluded. Further, and this is also important, kenosis frames the project of letting all voices speak in distinctly theological ways. Through kenosis, that project of including voices is tied to the soteriological claim that turning in a theological way to cultural plurality ultimately gives rise to a fuller revelation of God's presence. For example, when Martha Frederick suggests that kenosis offers a paradigm for a joint pilgrimage towards God. So typically here, and this is the crucial point I want to make, is that kenosis is used to tie an embrace of powerlessness, an embrace of vulnerability to the promise of ultimate all-encompassing plenitude, as it happens in the Philippa hymn, the well-known Philippa hymn. Humiliation ultimately leads to exaltation. I would like to have a closer look at this metaphor. The question here is, is it actually effective in disrupting the totalitarian logic of empire? So that disruption that intercultural theology aims at. A recent debate in feminist theology is actually illuminating here. This debate has been around the question that after kenosis has been feminized, has been used in patriarchal theology in order to justify the subjugation of women, can it actually be reclaimed by feminist theologians as a liberating concept? Sarah Coakley has said yes, and she has done this by extending vulnerability from an ideal of womanhood to a shared conditio humana. As a basis for a universal exhortation to vulnerability, Coakley says, kenosis can become a foundation for reconceiving power relations in non-patriarchal, in non-coercive ways, in ways that are oriented by and towards the gentle omnipotence of God, as she calls it. Anna Mercedes, however, a Hispanic theologian, argues that this interpretation does not actually lead to a transformation of hegemonic theology. Instead, she says, it makes for a theology that paradoxically asserts a power-hoarding God. In other words, and very shortly, I can't go into detail here, but the argument is that kenosis remains open to interpretations in which Christ's kenosis can itself become a gesture of imperial power. Mercedes' admonition that the theologies of kenosis can sustain rather than undo hegemonic theologies and hegemonic politics should make us cautious as to whether a similar problem might actually exist in intercultural theology. And my argument is, this is important here, my argument is that if kenosis is used to build a teleological arch from dispossession to plenitude, from humiliation to exaltation, when that theological arch is built, it does not actually fundamentally change the colonial logic in the politics of representation in global Christianity. And there is Yves Raguin, for example, uses kenosis for conceptualizing missionary spirituality. And that exemplifies, I think, this in stark ways. He says, by dispossession of self, we are able to absorb the amazing riches of others, the persons in themselves, and as they embody a cultural tradition. So he's talking about dispossessing ourselves in order to absorb riches of others. And here I think kenosis still supports a colonial logic of appropriation and thus erases the other in organizing cultural plurality within Christianity. So the question is, or this observation actually, that the theological framing of intercultural theology as kenosis resonates with critical voices who hold that intercultural theology has not actually lived up to its goal of decolonizing world Christianity. The desire to let all voices speak, they suggest, has not effectively led to a reconfiguration of colonial patterns in global theological discourses. Instead, intercultural theology is often practiced as a turn by white, European, or US American theologians to non-European theologies. And this non-European material is then, as Samuel Pang puts it, collected, analyzed, compared, competed with, and classified in such a way that Western subjects can occupy the central role in representing their theology. So in other words, European white theology stays silently the organizing principle, and intercultural theology turns to non-European theologies around that silent organizing principle. Such a practice of intercultural theology embraces the pluralization of theologies after colonialism in a way that does not effectively disrupt Western theological discourse. Instead, it quite literally capitalizes on other theologies in a way that silently restores white Western positions as the silent organizing principle of global Christianity. And the point I'm making here is that the turn to the other does not necessarily disrupt the colonial erasure of the subaltern. Instead, the desire for recognition, the desire for inclusion of the other can actually serve to reinforce the interpretative sovereignty of Western theology. Two terms from political philosophy can help us to understand this problem in more detail and also to search for possible alternatives. So what I would like to argue is that what we need in order to unsettle hegemonic frameworks of representation is not an ethics of recognition that aims to let all voices speak, but rather we need a politics of un/recognizability. So politics that interrogates the powerful conditions under which speaking becomes possible in the first place. So I'm differentiating here between an ethics of recognition and the politics of unrecognizability and recognizability. An ethics of recognition fails to disrupt the interpretive sovereignty of colonial power knowledge regimes precisely because it pays insufficient attention to how asymmetrical distributions of power regulate access to representation in intercultural encounters. They are oriented by the ideal of inclusion. Yesterday we talked about integration in this context, and oriented by this ideal of inclusion, this ethics naturalizes, and it means it simultaneously conceals and perpetuates the dominant regime of representation. In contrast, a politics of unrecognizability interrogates the powerful conditions under which speaking becomes possible, and it can thereby serve to expose and, in the next step, disrupt the hegemonic paradigm in the representation of global Christianity. So in my next step, I will explore how such a shift from an ethics of recognition to a politics of unrecognizability could actually be implemented in intercultural theology. I think we can argue that on the level of methodology, this shift is already taking place. For example, in approaches that make critical inquiries into the genealogies of key analytical concepts and theories in the study of Christianity. I'm quoting Martha Fredericks here. Crucially, such approaches do not only aim to produce materials from more inclusive perspectives, but they also critically assess our own processes of knowledge production in order to detect blind spots, in order to detect self-evidences, things that we just take for granted here. The results of such methodologies are complex histories of world Christianity that trace the diversity of beliefs and practices across time and space, in particular Christian communities' beliefs and practices. These local histories paint nuanced pictures of oppression and resistance, of erasure and agency, and how they are entangled within each other within the powerful framework of hegemonic regimes. And with these methodologies, we can come up with a nuanced, a complex history of the decolonization of Christianity that is not narrated as a teleological arch of redemption from dispossession towards plenitude in a way that makes ideally all voices speak. Instead, this methodology allows us to tell this history in nonlinear ways as a tactics of doing, but also undoing the imperial bias that is inscribed into the Christian tradition. And in this way, such a politics of unrecognizability translates into historiographical methods that do not reproduce the expansive, the teleological logic of empire, but it can serve to disrupt that logic. So in a nutshell, the field of intercultural theology begins to develop such critical descriptive methodologies that can unsettle the colonial logic in the representation of global Christianities. And I think we have seen that this descriptive critical approach over the past few days. But as I've argued above, the dominant theological imaginaries that regulate interculturality are prone to reproducing Western dominance in the representation of global Christianity, because they still follow a colonial logic of expansion by embracing an ethics of inclusion. So in order for intercultural theology to live up to its goal of decolonizing Christianity, we argue we also have to critically revise the theological imaginaries that orient our conversations around this topic. And in my final step, I will turn to this task. In the case of kenosis, we have seen above, a universal exhortation to vulnerability is not enough to transform the totalitarian logic of empire. Instead, we have to turn to concrete histories of wounds that account for the ways in which human vulnerability is always also particular. Vulnerability is not shared in equal ways, but it is experienced uniquely by each of us, and not just by each of us, but this experience of vulnerability in concrete histories of wounds has very much a political framework to it. So it is greatly influenced by the resources we possess and by how resources are distributed in political ways. So once we turn from this universal ideal of vulnerability to concrete histories of wounds, it becomes much harder to develop such a linear art of redemption from dispossession to plenitude. Instead, concrete histories of wounds yield much more complex narratives of afterliving in the wake of colonial trauma. And this is also true for the redemptive motives of the Christian tradition. So once we tell soteriology by turning to concrete wounds, we might not come up with that teleological art of redemption, but we come up with broken soteriologies. And then my argument will be that such broken soteriologies offer a better framework for talking about interculturality that does resist that totalitarian logic of trying to include everybody into a colonial system of representation. I'm turning here to Ben Eliev, a New Testament scholar who gives us a post-colonial reading of the Gospel of John, of the Passion according to John. And here he develops a narrative of resurrection in which the experience of death and the hope for life remain inextricably entangled into each other. He says here that that the cross is simultaneously a spectacle of Roman imperial power and also a specter of death that reveals the lethal violence at the foundation of Pax Romana. So Jesus, he says, died as an instrument of colonial sovereignty, and his wounded resurrection body, first and foremost, actually continues to tell a story about the power, about the might of his masters. This is why he was killed, in a way, to be a demonstration of colonial power. Yet at the same time, these wounds have the power to destabilize the empire's own master narrative by exposing the lethal ways by which empire brings peace. A remembrance of wounds can therefore create a narrative of resistance that rests hope for a different story, that rests hope for resurrection from the traumatic history of colonial power. Resurrection then does not appear as an unambivalent triumph of life over death, of life after death, but it is confirmed only through a hermeneutics of wounds within colonial trauma. When we re-embed resurrection in the concrete history of colonial wounds from which it emerged, the narrative of resurrection still turns around power and vulnerability as the two central themes of Christian soteriology, but it arranges them such that they do not give rise to the totalitarian promise of fulfillment that is rooted in gentle omnipotence. And so in the very final step, it is now my task to show if we can connect the dots between such post-colonial soteriologies and the methodological approach of a power-critical politics of unrecognizability. And for this, I will draw on the South African Cameroonian post-colonial theoretician Achille Mbembe, whose work also revolves around the question of how voices that have been erased by colonial power can speak. So the question of how is important here. For the historian Mbembe, this question presents itself first as a methodological problem. Namely, he says that archives, this is a problem for a historian, archives are necessarily incomplete because archives are fundamentally a matter of discrimination and of selection, and therefore make a selection that makes some material archivable and others unarchivable. The key question, therefore, is how can the voices of those for whom we have no written sources be made heard without glossing over differences in power, without erasing those concrete histories of wounds? Mbembe couches this methodological problem in soteriological terms of reparation, even allusions to resurrection are detectable in his work. He says, indeed, such a reading in incomplete archives is to try to repair something that has been broken. It is to return to life the harvest of bones. In his search for erased voices, Mbembe, not unlike Liev in his reading of the Passion of Christ, turns to concrete stories of wounds. Mbembe draws on the novels by Amos Tutuola, who writes about the slave trade in West Africa and who speaks about the ghastly practices of survival with which the enslaved eke out an existence amid the annihilating force of empire. And they do that by reassembling their destroyed lives from discarded body parts of others. And there's a lot of talk about smells, rotting smells of those body parts. It's quite a vivid, quite a horrific images actually of how life emerges out of the ruins, out of the debris of colonial death. So those enslaved engage spitefully in the work for life through a
Professor, sorry.
that rebuilds life out of debris. I'm done in 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Such a life forged from the wreckage of traumatic history does not congeal into a linear arch of redemption from dispossession to plenitude. Reparation in the aftermath of trauma does not allow for closure, but it takes place within a history of wounds, and it is irredeemably marked by trauma. So from these novels, Mbembe takes resources for the problem of incomplete archives, and he develops a historical approach which reiterates these precarious practices of reparation. He says reading in fragmented archives needs a supplement that has to be created out of the debris of information, so on the very site of the ruins. So proceeding by that logic of composition, by the logic of reparation, that functions according to the principle of incompletion, Mbembe finds in the tactics of spiteful survival resources for historiographical practices that defies the totalitarian desire of colonial power. It allows for an undoing of the erasure that of silenced voices that is not oriented towards plenitude, not oriented towards fulfillment, towards closure, but remains necessarily incomplete, and therefore has the potential to intervene into the totalitarian theology of empire. And from this, and this is my final sentence and my major argument, from this, intercultural theologians can glean a hermeneutical key that can orient their desire to listen to voices that have been erased by the force of empire, by telling complex histories and soteriologies rooted in concrete histories of wounds that do not promise absolute fulfillment at the end of times, but somehow struggle with concrete histories of wounds and find resurrection, traces of resurrection there. And when we have such theological imaginaries, we can pursue the project of letting all voices speak in ways that defy rather than reproduce the expansive force of empire. Decolonization, like salvation, takes place within colonial trauma and remains marked by its wounds. So thank you very much for your patience.
Grazie a lei, professoressa, per questa presentazione.
Thank you very much for your presentation. This that accompanies us to the conclusion of this Congress that this morning was focused on living interculturally and trained to interculturality, giving us tracks that can be the consequence of this track that we lived in the last few years. And I give the floor to Professor Pandolfi for the conclusion. Or if you have questions, maybe. We have Professor Betancourt and Professor Gruber are ready to answer to your questions.
Possiamo procedere. Bene, allora andiamo a concludere questo congresso. Come abbiamo visto in questi
As we saw in these days, we were challenged together by the issue of multiculturality in the places of formation, in the subjects of formation, that is, formators and formees, and also in the formative processes, that is, what formative processes help interculturality to become a place to manage the complexity in view of shared horizons in an interculture where the richness of all merges into something new. So we saw the interculturality of formators and formees, and also we tried to read the possible formative process, and also we made some reference to the context, to the spaces and the concrete occasions on which this formation becomes real every day, both in the context of high university education, in the context of education to consecrated life for men and women, and intercongregational. So it seems there's nothing to conclude. On the contrary, we should continue, go ahead, sometimes discover and take these new practices and make them grow, or try to put our hand at the absence of practices that are attentive on interculturality of formators and of formees, and on the attention to the complexity and plurality in this process of educational process. So I don't want to conclude anything. I invite you to continue to work together. We have been online with at least 400 people and more every day from different parts of Italy and the rest of the world with different time zones. This created a connection with the university. So I would like to make a first thanks to the university because they made all this possible. Maybe the rector can add a few words, but so both of those who worked internally and groups of the Secretary General, the Economet Sister Isabella, and those who supported us from outside the service, the simultaneous translation into 4 languages that you can find on the YouTube channel, that you can find also on the Facebook page of the Urbaniana, because all the work of these days has been recorded and you can listen to it any moment, So, and many of the speakers are very well-known people, so it is easy to find their contact. So great thanks goes to all those who enriched our being together, all the speakers of Wednesday, Thursday, and today. People from all over the world with a great experience, human experience, a great professional and disciplinary competence, and in some cases not very well known, but it was interesting to get to know them. In other cases, they are well known all over the world, have been working for many years on these contents. So thanks to all of them. I want to say something to students, many of those who get a formation in universities, and many of those members of religious congregations who have been attending are or will be formators and university teachers or spirit of formator. So treasurize this experience. Does not make it a subject that is only for today and tomorrow we shift to another subject. No, maybe tomorrow we can do something better on the basis of what we listen to. So the riches we received and that we shared ought to be not the judgment on reality, but a project for the future. And for all the formators who have been attending, teachers, educators, etc., we shouldn't be just touched by these, but we should be concerned. Normally you follow a congress by being seated, so we have to stand up and try to, because the different forms of wisdom of the world can get in touch with each other. And I was very impressed by this prophetic and provocative word, but very interesting, of Professor Betancourt, because a certain hegemonic project of the world, of the small world, the project of his, the problem of this hegemonic approach is that there is so little of the world within, a world that is closed, a world that defends itself, a world that exploits. But beyond the judgment, you can have all this kind of world. It is a small world. It is not so much of a world. There's so many different voices are not there. So many voices are not there. And we have to learn, must learn to have this more open vision. I heard today about affirmations such as, we must understand that the period of Christianity is over. The idea of widespread Christianity is over. So, two things. First, I'm not so sure that it is over, in the sense of the perception that people have. Sometimes it is a nostalgia, so it is still in the minds of people. And also, maybe I speak as an anthropologist, but this affirmation, the time of Christianity is over, is a Eurocentric idea. The correct sentence would be, the time of Christianity is over in Europe. Because in India, in China, in Africa, the time of Christianity has never been there. So this idea that our world is the world, no, our world is little. So the principle of Christianity is over in Europe, maybe, or it is over in the places where the Eurocentric matrix is prevailing. But for 10,000 years, many areas never, in that areas, it never began. So the fact that today the world should shift from a position to another, when the position is not a position, is only a position of a small part of the world. So this the concern of some categories, they are very interesting categories, but we have to contextualize them. They are the categories of someone, the cultural process of someone, not of all. So for formators, this intellectual honesty has to be a tool we must have inside. I hope these 3 days gave to each of us, and no one should feel excluded. You shouldn't. No one should feel that you are saying this for others, not for you. No, these principles should always guide us. Sometimes we have to thematize it on the issue of multiculturality, and other times simply by keeping it as background concern. So I hope these 3 days helped each of us, no one excluded, to bring this concern within us, this passion for the wide richness and for the many stories, many narrations, many voices that have been speaking for such a long time. So thanks to all of you. I think the last thanks goes to the GHR Foundation of Minneapolis, that has accompanied with a great professionality this process, and they will accompany the publication of the proceedings. So, and I give the final floor to our rector, Professor Leonardo Sileo. So I thank all of you who have been attending even the third day of this Congress with your physical presence. Especially thanks to those who got connected with us in these 3 days online. And when almost 4 years ago, it was maybe October of 2017, I had been recently became a rector, Professor Pandolfi and Professor Longhitano came to me and spoke to me about this project. Maybe you remember, I was perplexed because they thought it is complicated, especially because for me it was the first experience of funding that came from so far, from the US. But maybe you remember, I was particularly happy of the topic you had chosen. It is multiculturality and interculturality and transculturality. That was mentioned several times. So we can give what is original and authentic and common. So I'm very happy for you that you brought ahead your task, you implemented your task. I'm happy you involved 16 universities, institutions from different areas in the world, many of them from Rome, but not only. That is important. I'm very happy also for the 20 congregations and religious communities that were involved and specifically work on formation. So religious communities, universities, that will be the workshop of the future for this. And we have this responsibility not to only bear the burden of our history, but create a future, a new life and a renewal. So I really thank you, because concretely with Professor Oddone, you created this event and you imagined it so technological, so it can be the beginning for new initiatives. And I'm very happy that also the other faculties have contributed to this, with the Dean of the Faculty of Theology. So I wish that this is not a point that concludes, but something that begins what should follow afterwards. And we have the responsibility to learn, to be together. And one of the many sentences I heard in these days, when you made reference to us, let us imagine us without them. Because if it is separate us and them, it means that something doesn't work. So you can imagine racism, marginalization, etc. So you have to imagine we and them, everything like Father and Son and Holy Spirit in the only God. So thank you very much. I don't want to add anything more. I'm very satisfied.
Un arrivederci a tutti e che questo
Goodbye to everyone, and I hope this Congress bears fruit, and have a good return home, and see you again to all the others. Special greeting to all those who are connected online. Bye-bye.